In nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti. Amen. This evening I'd like to discuss the Latin language in the life of the Church, especially as it pertains to the formation of her priests, in particular asking, what is the will of the Church on this issue before, during, and after Vatican II, and what is the current state of Latin and priestly formation today? Lastly, I'd like to share with you some information about the organization I represent and how we are trying to respond to the will of the Church. To begin, in his letter to the Galatians, St. Paul emphasized the importance of the context of our Lord's birth, writing that Christ was born in the fullness of time and under the law of Moses. St. Luke gives further context, reminding us that he was born under the first Roman emperor, Caesar Augustus. The same empire would later crucify the Son of God and eventually take Christianity as her official imperial religion. In short, God, in his perfect providence, chose the Roman Empire as an instrument in the work of salvation and to spread its saving message throughout the known world. Should it be any surprise, then, that upon the legalization of Christianity in the 4th century, the Church would take to herself the imperial language of Latin? And so it was. Before long, Latin became the official language of the Church in Rome and all the West, in her liturgy, in her fathers and doctors, in her dogma, and in her mind. Latin became the language between the bride and her bridegroom. Even after Latin ended as a vernacular and the Romance languages developed, Holy Mother Church found it fitting to retain Latin as a sacred language as a sign of her Catholicity or universality, a lingual mustard seed, if you will, planted alongside the blood of Peter and Paul in Rome, eventually taking root and branching across the globe and across time. Let us then travel forward a millennium or so to the time of the formation of seminaries following the 16th century Council of Trent. For much of this talk, I shall draw from the work of Dr. John Pepino, professor at Our Lady of Guadalupe Seminary in Denton, Nebraska, who has studied the history and eventual decline of Latin and priestly formation. He notes that from the time of Trent until the mid-19th century, seminaries strongly emphasized Latin, essentially requiring seminarians to be completely fluent in all modes of communication: reading, listening comprehension, composition, and speech. In the 19th century, however, things began to change. Natural sciences were developing and schools began transitioning away from Latin to those new fields of study. It is in this context that we begin to hear clearly the Church enunciate her will regarding Latin. A local council in Paris in 1849 declared that seminarians must have, quote, a full and imperfect intelligence of Latin, end quote. Pope Leo XIII, in his 1899 encyclical on the education of clergy, laments the decline of Latin, calling it, along with Greek, quote, the depositaries of those masterpieces of sacred science which the Church, with good reason, counts among her most precious treasures, end quote. Bishops and seminaries, moreover, must guard the deposit of Latin against innovators. And likewise, quote, once in possession of the Latin tongue, the key, so to say, of sacred science, young men destined for the priesthood pass from the junior to the senior seminary, end quote. Pope St. Pius X would also grieve, quote, we do not at all approve of the generalized neglect of the study of the Latin language, end quote. Pius XI asked the German bishops to step in, quote, let the bishops especially take charge and diligently see to it that the study of the Latin language, which accompanies and assists the Catholic religion in all the West, should regain its strength in the hope of its ancient glory. For it is to be grieved that so many clerics and priests, insufficiently knowledgeable in this language, the heritage of ancient wisdom being relegated to the background and distinguished works of our authors being neglected, in which works of dogma of our faith are solidly and clearly propounded and strongly and victoriously defended against the attacks of its adversaries, acquire their doctrine from books and periodicals published in the vernacular, with the result that there is often a lack of precision in language, of careful presentation of the argumentation, and a faithful interpretation of dogma, end quote. In a letter to the Cardinal Prefect of Seminaries, Pius XI sounded another warning, arguing that in studying theology in the vernacular, quote, there is no precision of idiom and a careful method of argument, and likewise a faithful interpretation of dogma is lacking, end quote. Pius XI would make his concerns public in a 1924 motu proprio, saying, quote, "No wonder that our predecessors never refrained, when the times warranted it, from intervening in the fortunes of Latin, because they acted with the more zeal that Latin letters had fallen into a worse condition," end quote. By 1928, the Holy See began taking specific actions. For instance, the Sacred Congregation of Seminaries to the bishops of the United States recommended that Latin was to be regarded as the most important element in humanities. Oral and written exercises were necessary. Candidates to philosophy have to possess a sufficient mastery of the Latin language, and compulsory catch-up classes would be had if necessary. Under Pius XII, we see in his 1951 address to Latin teachers, quote, "Alas, the Latin language, the glory of priests, today has practitioners that are too weak and too few," end quote. In 1957, the Sacred Congregation for Seminaries, in a letter addressed to the bishops of the world, said, quote, "There is no lack of priests who, when it comes to Latin, labor under such great ignorance that they not only are unable to speak it without difficulty or to write it without committing grammatical mistakes, but also cannot understand even the easiest of Latin authors," end quote. This then takes us to Pope St. John the 23rd. Isn't he the Pope who opened the door to modernization and the vernacular, pushing Latin aside? Not at all. Of all the popes before or since, St. John offers the strongest defense of Latin. On February 22nd, 1962, a mere 8 months before Vatican II, St. John promulgated Veterum Sapientia on the promotion of the study of Latin. Here are just a few points from the document. 1. The Church has clothed her teaching in the golden dress of Greek and Latin thought and language. The Roman Empire also was a providential matrix for the spread of Christianity. 2. Latin is perfect for the universal church, for it's an international language that raises no envy. 3. St. John repeats the words of Pius XI on the utility of Latin as a language for the church. Quote, "Indeed, the church, since she holds all nations in her embrace and will last till the consummation of the ages, requires a language that is by its very nature universal, unchanging, and not vulgar," end quote. 4, Latin is a treasure, a door open to all to enter into the ancient truths of Christianity, a bond uniting all Christians. 5, its study sharpens the mind of youth. But here's the heart of the document. Quote, "And we also, impelled by the weightiest of reasons, the same as those which prompted our predecessors in provincial synods, are fully determined to restore this language to its position of honor and to do all we can to promote its study and use. The employment of Latin has recently been contested in many quarters, and many are asking what the mind of the Apostolic See is in this matter. We have therefore decided to issue the timely directives contained in this document so as to ensure that the ancient and uninterrupted use of Latin be maintained and, where necessary, restored," end quote. He continues, quote, "And now, in the full consciousness of our office and in virtue of our authority, decree and command the following," end quote. So he's no longer talking about the nice things about Latin. He's actually using his papal authority. What does he have to say? 1, bishops and religious superiors are to see to it that the provisions to follow are applied wherever men study for the priesthood or religious life. 2, no one is to write against the use of Latin in seminary instruction or in the liturgy, nor is he to water down the Holy See's will. 3, seminarians are to be thoroughly trained in Latin before they enter theology, lest they should be unable to follow lectures and participate in the debates that best prepare the youth to defend the truths of faith. And as for late vocations, the same standard applies. No one is to enter theology who has not been clearly and perfectly educated in Latin and is comfortable in using it. 4, the Latin-based traditional curriculum is to return to Catholic schools, all Catholic schools. 5, greater sacred disciplines must be taught in Latin. Those who teach in seminaries must speak Latin and use Latin books. If they cannot, they are to be replaced by those who can. But he says this can happen gradually. Number 6, an academy of Latinity to govern the use of the language is to be erected. And finally, the Sacred Congregation for Seminaries is to draw up a Latin curriculum for seminaries. If you realize that such a curriculum was in fact drawn up and was promulgated just 2 months later, in painstaking detail covering 30 pages, this curriculum gives a semester-by-semester outline for Latin studies in seminaries. How much Cicero, how much Jerome, how much Horace, etc. Essentially calls for 7 years of Latin, 5 to 6 hours per week. The Holy See would even organize visitations to seminaries to ensure its implementation. So, St. John wasn't exactly ambiguous in these documents, nor was he ambiguous about the manner of their promulgation, which is even more telling about his seriousness about the subject. First, consider the type of document Veterum Sapientia is, an apostolic constitution. It's hard to get more authoritative than that. These documents are reserved for promulgating such things as the Catechism of the Catholic Church, the 1983 Code of Canon Law, not to mention the ex cathedra declaration of the Immaculate Conception by Pope Pius IX. Second, Veterum Sapientia was also promulgated in the presence of a large number of cardinals and on the high altar of St. Peter's Basilica. Not even the conciliar documents enjoyed such a privilege. St. John saw the decline of Latin and did everything he possibly could to save it. So far, this is all pre-Vatican II. Did the council itself do away with Latin? Not at all. In paragraph 36 of Sacrosanctum Concilium on the liturgy, although some use of the vernacular is permitted, we read, quote, "The use of the Latin language is to be preserved in the Latin rites," end quote. Also, quote, "In accordance with the centuries-old tradition of the Latin rite, the Latin language is to be retained by clerics in the divine office," end quote. The decree on priestly training, Optatum Totius, states that seminarians, quote, "are to acquire a knowledge of Latin which will enable them to understand and make use of the sources, the fontes, of so many sciences and of the documents of the Church," end quote. In other words, all seminarians should be able to pick up St. Augustine or St. Thomas in Latin and read them without a problem. Also during the Council, Pope Paul VI, following the mandate of Veterum Sapientia, did in fact establish the Pontifical Institute of Higher Latin Studies at the Salesian University in Rome, and while doing so, reiterating the need for seminarians to be formed in Latin. Following the Council, Pope Paul VI continued defending Latin. In 1968, he said to a group of Latinists, quote, "We wish to repeat here and now before this distinguished assembly that Latin must continue to be fostered above all in our seminaries. Without Latin, the higher and complete intellectual, theological, and liturgical formation which the modern world demands of priests would be minimized," end quote. And that's even after a great deal of Latin had been jettisoned. Pope St. John Paul II promulgated the 1983 Code of Canon Law, which states in Canon 249 that seminarians, quote, lingua latina bene caliant. In other words, in English, seminarians should be able to understand Latin well. But it's even stronger than that. Caliant comes from calere, meaning to understand, but also skilled or even calloused. In other words, the current universal law of the Church says that seminarians must be well calloused in their knowledge of Latin, having used it so much. Lastly, in 2012, on the 50th anniversary of Veterum Sapientia, Pope Benedict XVI, in his Motu Proprio Lingua Latina, reaffirmed the exhortations of St. John, saying, quote, "In our time, too, knowledge of the Latin language and culture is proving to be more necessary than ever for the study of the sources which numerous ecclesiastical disciplines draw from," end quote. So on paper, at least, I'd say the Church has been pretty clear on the issue of Latin before, during, and after the Council. But where are we today? Have the Church's many admonitions and promulgations since John 23rd been obediently received? Well, if this is any indication, the day after Veterum Sapientia was signed, Jesuits in Rome, having up until that point taught in Latin, began teaching in Italian. Within just 8 months, the Second Vatican Council began thus stealing all the attention as the Church looked forward towards reform. That said, as it seemed clear that St. John saw fortifying Latin as a preparation to the council and as a prerequisite for renewal in the church. Before long, of course, the turmoil and confusion of that period set in, and this great document quickly became a candidate for the most ignored papal document of the 20th century. Far from restoring and fostering Latin, this venerable language essentially dropped everywhere, completely, and not just in the liturgy. The collapse was so complete, in fact, that just last fall, Italian replaced Latin as the official language of the Synod on the Family. In seminaries today, and even those with the reputation of being traditional or conservative, if there is Latin, the usual requirement is a mere 2 semesters, hardly covering basic grammar. Not infrequently as well do seminarians or dioceses replace Latin with Spanish. Sadly, in truth, I think a very small percentage of graduating seminarians are even able to understand the Latin written on their diplomas. What exacerbates the problem further, I think, is that seminary faculties often know what the church is asking in regards to Latin, but they have resigned themselves to the present situation and thus make no effort to improve. So, to find out whether I was misguided or simply crazy, I decided to do something. Several years ago, I met with a highly ranked cardinal very familiar with the law of the church. As our conversation was in private, I will keep him anonymous. Nonetheless, I shared with him what I have shared with you here and simply asked him, is complete proficiency in Latin for seminarians still the mind of the church? He immediately laughed off the question and said, of course. So with that answer, this is how I see our situation. Since Christianity was legalized in the 4th century, Latin was officially and in practice the language of the church, and priests were expected to be fluent. Since its decline began in the mid-19th century to the present, nearly every pope has rigorously defended it. Vatican II upheld it. The universal law of the church currently demands it. How could the church be any clearer on this issue? Why are so few fighting for this? Does the church not speak with the voice of Christ? And if she does, are we free to ignore her commands? The answer is clear. Despite the current situation, or any situation for that matter, we must always be faithful to the will of the church. We must fight to save Latin or do whatever we can to help. And so in 2013, we organized the first Veterum Sapientia conference at Belmont Abbey College. We will soon have our third in Washington, D.C. in August. It's a week-long event for priests, seminarians, and religious, and it's conducted entirely in Latin. Through lectures, small groups, games, plays in the Jesuit drama tradition, and some wine, participants learn to engage fully the language as the popes intended. Within mere days, many participants are able to follow lectures and can even hold basic conversation. In fact, one seminarian just last year, on our final evening, having been conversing about current events in the life of the church completely in Latin for well over an hour, turned to me in disbelief that he was speaking in Latin and said, I have been deprived of my priestly formation. How true that is, for we have been deprived of our very own language. So who's involved in our project? Well, since so few are fighting for Latin in the church, an upside is that the best of the best are instantly available, and we have an enviable team. For instance, the first year we had the chief Vatican Latinist of 40 years and arguably the finest in the world, Father Reginald Foster. Now he's a bit too infirm to travel, but his successor in the Vatican's Latin office, Monsignor Dan Gallagher, is with us, as well as Dr. Nancy Llewellyn, Dr. John Pepino, Dr. Gerald Malsbury, and Father Kevin Zilverberg. Right now, we're simply a group of people who are putting on conferences. We currently have a website advertising our upcoming conference, but only part of it is available to the public. The rest is still under construction. The whole website is intended to be a hub of everything Latin in the church. In one section, we will present the will of the church regarding Latin. In another, we will advertise our conference. And in the final section, a blog of sorts to keep up with the current Latin events in the life of the church. For instance, the resignation of Pope Benedict being delivered in Latin, the secular reports about the popularity of the Vatican Twitter feed in Latin, or again, Latin being replaced by Italian in last year's synod. Seeing the complete collapse of Latin in ecclesial life, yet knowing we have the will of the Church supporting us, the idea of working at the service of St. John's Veterum Sapientia is a very exciting prospect indeed. A great deal of work remains, as well as a number of possibilities of expanding our work, especially with the advent of online education. Furthermore, a very prominent institution of higher learning in Europe has already expressed interest in cooperating with our work. So perhaps this great expansion will come to fruition, and perhaps even soon. As of now, our immediate needs aren't terribly great. The last 2 years, our conferences have paid for themselves, more or less. But this year, relocating to Washington and trying to keep costs low for seminarians, we may in fact need some assistance making ends meet, especially if the number of participants are lower than expected. We do sometimes get requests of financial assistance from seminarians as well. But two costs we do need covered, however, deal with constructing and maintaining the website, as well as a promotional video. A video is important because when people hear of a Latin conference, they think we're conjugating verbs all week or something. They really need to see the effective and entertaining way we learn Latin, and to see that it is actually possible to speak it. So you all are my guinea pigs to see what type of support there is for the idea of saving Latin in the Church. If there is in fact strong support, that will be an indication that we should be pushing forward confidently and quickly in our endeavors. This year we are partnering with the International Institute for Culture, who is providing administrative support. They're a 501c3 organization, and so if you'd like to support our efforts, you can visit our website at veterumsapientia.com and find the donate button, or write a check made out to the International Institute for Culture, or IIC, with the memo saying Veterum Sapientia. Their mailing address can be found on their website, www.iiculture.org. I leave you with this. Dr. John Haas, president of the same institute, recently met with Pope Emeritus Benedict. Benedict was especially interested in their classics program. He then told Dr. Haas, quote, "Without Latin, we do not know who we are or where we come from. In nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti. Amen."